We're going to talk about how to identify the three different types of muscle and then our one nervous tissue slide. So, muscle, like when we talked about epithelium and connective tissue, and how those tissues share general characteristics, muscle also share general characteristics. Um, all muscle cells or tissues have the ability to move, so they generate movement. They're also responsible, we don't really think about this as a function or a characteristic of muscle, but they generate heat. So, muscle contractions um, help produce heat, and that heat is absorbed by our blood and distributed evenly throughout our body. So, that heat generation helps maintain an overall body temperature. Muscle cells are referred to as being muscle fibers. So, a lot of times you'll hear someone say, and I say it, muscle fiber. And what I'm referring to is a whole muscle cell. We call them muscle fibers because they're elongated, they're very long. The reason for that is the longer a cell is, the more force they can generate when they contract, right? The longer they are. So, muscle fibers, I do not mean like protein fibers, or when I talk about collagen fibers and elastic fibers and connective tissue, those are protein fibers. Those are not those are not cells. Muscle fiber refers to a muscle cell. There are three types of muscles that you'll be responsible for identifying: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So, skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle fibers, right? Skeletal muscle cells are very long, and they are very long because they're throughout development. They actually are formed by multiple cells fusing and creating a syncytium, right? So multiple cells fuse, and that's why when you look at an individual muscle fiber, you can see these little dark staining ovals. Those are the nuclei. And look, this one muscle fiber has multiple nuclei pushed to the periphery. So this is actually multiple cells that have fused together throughout development. Okay, so that we can get these really long cells. So, skeletal muscle, a lot of times you will see it running, all the muscle fibers running in parallel with one another because they create, a skeletal muscle that is attached to the skeleton and moves our skeleton. These are bundles of muscle fibers, all oriented in one direction because they're pulling on bones to generate some sort of movement. So, for the most part, they will be running all parallel to one another. If you look at a tongue slide, a tongue is actually lots of skeletal muscle because, well, when you think of skeletal muscle, you want to think voluntary movement. Voluntary meaning you have the ability to control it, it's under conscious control. So I can decide to move my body, to walk in space. I decide that I want to talk, and talking requires moving your tongue. So that's all skeletal muscle. So if you look at a skeletal muscle at a tongue slide, you'll see lots and lots of skeletal muscle, but the fibers will actually be running in all different directions. It doesn't look as nice and banded like this. Reason for that is because your tongue has to move in lots of different directions to generate, to manipulate the sound that's coming out of the oral cavity and to create speech. So skeletal muscle in the tongue will look slightly different in just that they're not all running parallel. They'll be running in lots of different directions. Okay. But a tongue slide, you'll find skeletal muscle. You'll also find stratified squamous epithelium because the tongue is, in the oral cavity, open to the outside and subject to abrasion. So you'll also see stratified squamous epithelium on a tongue slide. Okay, so what you're looking for is long muscle fibers running in parallel for the most part. Nuclei are pushed to the periphery, and the standout feature are these striations. Okay, so running perpendicular to the length of the skeletal muscle fiber, you see all of these striations. We'll learn when we get to the skeletal muscle the muscle chapter that these striations are formed by light and dark, thick and thin filaments. Okay, so you see striations, nuclei pushed to the periphery, elongated muscle fibers. This is skeletal muscle. Okay. Here is a less perfect image It's a little bit more challenging to see the discrete muscle fiber cells, but if you were to go in and out of fine focus on this slide, you would see these striations. So look very hard and you'll see the striations running in this direction. Nuclei push to the periphery, parallel bundles of muscle fibers, and you see striations. So a lot of times, like on the test, you might have to, in order to see a tissue and to see all of its characteristics, kind of go in and out of fine focus just a tidbit. And if you go in and out of fine focus, you can see those striations really well. Here is a muscle tendon slide. So if you get a tendon slide or a muscle tendon junction slide, you will be able to see, this should look familiar because down here, this is our tendon, and tendons are made up of dense, regular connective tissue because it's tightly packed bundles of collagen fibers running in all one direction, and collagen resists pulling forces in one direction, right? One direction because they're all parallel. And so high tensile strength resists pulling forces. Makes sense that a tendon would be made up of dense regular connective tissue because it connects a skeletal muscle to the skeleton, and the muscle is constantly pulling on the tendon and on the bones, right? So this is a tendon right here. You see that wavy, somewhat glassy tissue. They're all running in the same direction. So if you go in and out of fine focus, it kind of looks a little bit glassy in appearance because it's the majority collagen fibers. This is the dense regular connective tissue. Above here, this is the skeletal muscle, and if you look, you see the striations, okay? Now, this, you can see that when this slide got cut, it actually, the muscle started to kind of rip away, so it doesn't look as nice as, say, this slide or this slide, but it's still skeletal muscle. You see the striations, and it's attached to a tendon, so, or dense regular connective tissue, so even more of a giveaway because tendons connect skeletal muscle to bone. Okay. Here is an image. Some of the muscle tendon slides in our lab will actually have, so up here, this is our dense regular connective tissue of the tendon. And here, this is actually all skeletal muscle cells, but they're in cross section rather than longitudinal section, like these slides. And so when you look at a muscle fiber, a skeletal muscle fiber in cross section, it looks like little circles, right? And you can see the nuclei. I will not ask skeletal muscle like this, okay? This is still a muscle tendon slide, dense regular connective tissue, but the muscle is in cross section. I will not ask skeletal muscle like this. I will ask skeletal muscle so that you can see striations, okay? I will make sure you can see striations. Cardiac muscle. Now, cardiac muscle, and I've already mentioned the locations again. I said skeletal muscle is located in skeletal muscles, which is also an organ. So skeletal muscles are tissue, but skeletal muscles are also organs, and those are the muscles that are attached to the skeleton, and the function is to move the skeleton throughout the environment, okay? Cardiac muscle you find in the heart also aids in movement, but in this case, that movement is pumping and propelling the blood and providing the force, that blood pressure behind, providing the blood pressure so that our blood can flow throughout our cardiovascular system. You see striations in cardiac muscle, so both skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle have striations, okay? The key difference between skeletal and cardiac, the easiest to see, is that along with the striations, you'll see these darker staining striations, right? They're running in the same direction as the other striations, but there are a few scattered throughout that are very dark, okay? These darker striations, these are actually called intercalated discs. And intercalated discs are actually specialized gap junctions. And what gap junctions do is they connect multiple cells together, and so the cells can share a cytoplasm. Sharing a cytoplasm allows for things like electrical signals to travel very quickly from one cell to the next, okay? And so these gap junctions, these intercalated discs, are really important so that when a heart fires, that electrical impulse is sent along the sets of cavities so quickly that we have the atria of the heart contracting together. Okay, we have the ventricles of the heart contracting together. So to get a nice synchronized contraction within the heart, we want that electrical impulse to travel really quickly, and so cardiac muscle this tissue has these intercalated discs. So if you see striations, and then you see these darker striations called intercalated discs, this is cardiac muscle. If you see striations but no intercalated discs, then it's skeletal muscle. So both skeletal and cardiac have striations. Cardiac is involuntary muscle, however. We do not have to think about our heart contracting and pumping blood. It does it on its own. It's autorhythmic, and we don't have to think about it. So it's involuntary muscle. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. Okay? Some other characteristics of cardiac muscle, which is sometimes a little bit harder to tell, but I'll go ahead and talk about it. These cells are uninucleate, whereas skeletal muscle cells have multiple nuclei. Okay? And cardiac muscle is actually highly branched. So there's more of a branching pattern. They're not as tightly packed and parallel as skeletal muscle fibers. Okay? But the main giveaway that this is cardiac muscle and not skeletal is those intercalated discs. If you see those and striations, it's cardiac muscle. Here's a higher magnification image that really shows you the beautiful branching nature of the cardiac muscle cells. And then look at these really pretty intercalated discs. And you can see how they cross multiple cells. So these are those gap junctions that connect multiple cells so that electrical impulse can travel really, really fast. And we get nice synchronized contractions of the heart. Okay? Intercalated discs, cardiac muscle. Here's a silver stain. So another reason why you can't learn by color, because there are lots of different stains out there. You can see striations, but it's not cardiac, or it's not skeletal muscle, it's cardiac because you see the intercalated discs. So when you see intercalated discs, it's cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, you do not see striations. That's why it's called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is also an involuntary type of muscle. We do not have to think about it contracting. And you find smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs, blood vessels, all along the digestive tract, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, in the bladder, in the uterus. Okay, so in the walls of hollow organs, you find smooth muscle because it's involuntary and we don't have to think about it contracting. We don't have to think about the intestines contracting and propelling the food throughout the digestive system, right? It happens without us thinking about it. Smooth muscle, involuntary. No striations. So smooth muscle, also uninucleate, so there's only one nucleus per cell, and it has somewhat of a spindle shape to it. Okay, so spindle-shaped fibers. They're not as long, okay, as cardiac or skeletal. Okay, here's another image of smooth muscle. So up here, smooth muscle, here, smooth muscle. You don't really see the individual cells as well as this one, okay, but all running in the same direction. So this is how I would ask smooth muscle. And usually the way that I ask it is not on this high of magnification. I will actually have it on a lower magnification, and I'll have it I will be pointing to smooth muscle from a hollow organ. So I'll try to find an intestine slide or a large artery slide. And the reason why I do that is because I will ask the smooth muscle, and you'll be able to see the circular nature, the cells going around a circular organ, and that will help because, again, smooth muscle is found in the walls of hollow organs. So get an intestine slide. to look for smooth muscle, or a large artery slide to look for smooth muscle, and that will really help. The only thing that any student has maybe mixed this up with is dense regular connective tissue, and the reason I because of practicing so much, I don't see the similarities. But if you go in and out of fine focus, right? If you go in and out of fine focus, this smooth muscle is not going to look nearly as glassy in appearance as this dense regular connective tissue right here, okay? Because these are protein fibers. These are cells, okay? So this is a large artery slide, and this big thick layer that's labeled TM, okay? This big thick layer that's running around this circular organ, this is all smooth muscle. And so this is how I would try to ask it on the test, okay? Is you would be able to see that it's a part of, or makes up part of the wall of a hollow organ. Here's an intestine slide. So this would all be smooth muscle. This is how I could also ask it. This would all be smooth muscle right here, part of the wall of a hollow organ. And all of this would be lined with simple columnar epithelium because it's an intestine slide. Okay, so if you were to go up on high magnification over here, you would find simple columnar epithelium. And even in this layer right here, if you went up on high magnification, you would be able to see simple cuboidal glands, right? So remember, when you're looking at organ slides, you can find lots of different types of tissues because one organ is made up of multiple tissues. So that's a way for you to practice in lab, is put an organ on there and try to identify as many tissues as you can, okay? Even if you pick up an intestine slide for the sole purpose of identifying smooth muscle, you know that simple columnar epithelium should be also in the intestine slide, so try to identify that as well, okay? This is another example of how an organ can have multiple types of tissues. This is a trachea slide. All of this, hyaline cartilage, right? All of this is hyaline cartilage. You know that you find it in the trachea. If you move up here, lining the trachea, this would be if you were to go up on high magnification, this would be pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium. And then if you look in this layer right here, you would actually be able to find lots and lots of simple cuboidal glands, okay? So again, pick up an organ slide and try to identify as many tissues as you can, and that will really help you practice. So if I have the pointer here, the specific would be smooth, the general would be muscle. If I have the pointer here, the specific would be cardiac, the general would be muscle. If I have the pointer here, the specific would be skeletal, the general would be muscle. And then the very last slide is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue, you find it in the brain and spinal cord primarily, so the central nervous system, and it's made up of two major classifications of cells: neurons, and all of neurons, which are these larger cells, right, with a large cell body and lots of processes coming off of them. And then these little tiny dots that are all over the place, those are all neuroglial cells, which are supporting cells. Not worried about you knowing that yet. Mainly going to ask you to identify these cells right here. So these neurons are called multipolar neurons, or you can call them motor neurons, okay? So if I have the pointer here, you would say multipolar or motor neuron, and the general would be nervous. Okay, so specific would be multipolar neuron, the general would be nervous tissue. Okay, location, brain and spinal cord, and the functions of nervous tissue is to be able to receive internal and external stimuli, be able to integrate and analyze what that stimulus means, and then tell the appropriate parts of the body how to respond. Okay. So nervous tissue takes in both internal and external stimuli integrates it, analyzes it, decides what it means, and then just communicates with the rest of the body on how to respond appropriately. Okay, so that is nervous tissue. Again, specific would be multipolar or motor neuron, and the general would be nervous. I don't know. This is so easy to identify. I would have the pointer on one of these large neurons. You can see it has a large cell body. That little dark staining circle that's in the center, that's the nucleus. And then it has these really long processes that come off of it. No other tissue looks like this. So usually this is a pretty easy couple of points on the test is if I give you the nervous tissue slide. To me, it looks like if you've ever seen War of the Worlds, the little alien things that walk around. Kind of looks like a little Cyclops alien ship, or that's what it looks like to me. However you want to think about it, you think about it that way. But little Cyclops alien ships kind of thing is what it looks like to me with those really long, feet that walk. Anyways, okay, so that's the end of histology.